uh, um, uh, let's see. Well, maybe
Well, I
just
wanted to know, to interrupt you because I'm really good at interrupting people. I think it is really important, Lewis, when you talk about the Great Divorce and different things. In the Great Divorce, if I recall, at one point they talk about hell as being like a dust ball. It's this
right.
really small thing,
Hmm.
and yet to the people in them, it's everything, right? It's
Hmm.
like it's all, and also really important in Lewis. I always think about Lewis. Lewis was part of that generation, just like Chesterton and Oxford, where elegance and thinking were very strongly connected.
Hmm.
It's just extraordinary. But what's so interesting in Lewis, in the Great Divorce, this is a big generality, but people's situation is often a result of a disorder. Like, Augustine says that basically all evil is a disordered good. That there's nothing wrong with sex, but there's something wrong with lust. There's nothing wrong with food, but there's something wrong with gluttony, a disordered relationship.
Hmm.
That evil emerges from a disordered relationship. Well, that note relation is really important because we've been talking about Hegel this entire time and certain relationships and things like that, the relation of I to the other and different things. And also too, like you have in Dante, and it's also in kind of C.S. Lewis, this idea that love, like parents' love for their children, can be precisely why they end up damned. And that, the famous line that hell is locked from the inside, right? That there are these sort of you can come out of hell anytime. You just don't, because you have a disordered relationship. You have a disordered. What I think, and I think it's one of the things I always liked about Lewis is that so much of the problems are a result of an internally consistent logic that's just separated from truth. But relative to the logic, it's all sound. Everything that's being said, like the monkey at the end of the Chronicles of Narnia, every argument the monkey uses against ants, it works really well. You just have to know it's wrong. The best book I read it a long time ago, but I'd always Till We Have Faces, I recall being a masterpiece. And of course, there's the end of the space trilogy. But one of the things that's really important in Lewis is that in that story of Till We Have Faces, I think it's Psyche and Orla. Psyche, there's this big famine, and Psyche has to be sacrificed to the gods to save the gods, and Orla is devastated because it's the sister and different things like that. And so Psyche is put on a tree, and Orla is devastated. But she goes back to the tree later and sees that Psyche's still alive. And she's so thrilled. She's like, "Oh my gosh, you're still alive!" And Psyche looks great, and she's like, "You've been tied to this tree for a really long time. What's up?" And Psyche's like, "Well, I'm married to God." And you're like, "What?" It's like, "Yes, we're in the palace right now." And you're like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, "Yes, and Orla's like, sis, and loves her sister. And she's like, "It's about to rain. We need to get going." He's like, "We don't have to worry about the rain because we're under roof." And Orla's looking around. It's like, "What are you talking about?" It starts to rain. Psyche's just sitting in the rain talking about her husband and different things like that. So basically, Psyche is looks like she's crazy, right? That she's completely insane. And Orla has every reason to think that Psyche is nuts, right? But Psyche's like, and Psyche starts talking about her husband, and she says, he says, "I can't see his face, that he's always in darkness. I can't see him entirely, and that there's good reason for it." And Orla's like, "Well, that's creepy and that's terrible." And Psyche's like, "Look, there's good reason for it. I just got to trust and believe." And Orla's like, "No, you got to take that mask off and see what's going on." And Psyche's like, "No, I won't do it because that's like my husband has forbid me from doing that." And Orla's like, "You got to do it." But nothing that Orla comes up with a lot of reasons that are really good. And Psyche has no answer, like basically, because everything Orla is saying is like legit. It's like, you're nuts. Like rationality is internally consistent that Orla is presenting. It's all giving very, very good reasons.
Right. Sorry, just to interrupt. Do you think that this Orla character is supposed to be like Satan, like in the way Paralandra you have?
Well, here we go. This is the part okay. That's unbelievable. And the thing I want to get at is that Lewis is always identifying the break between rationality and truth, which is the space that Hegel's thinking occupies with paradox, and the break between the map and the territory, which is I like to call it the Gödel point, but that is the point of the utmost decision, the critical decision. That is the decision of absolute knowing, basically. But it's also the same place where everything can fall apart. And this is what I mean by that. So Orla pulls out a knife, and she takes out her arm and she stabs it slightly, and Psyche's losing her mind. And Orla says, "If you don't leave your husband, I will kill myself." And Psyche looks at Orla and is like, "You got to trust me." And she's like, "No, you're crazy." And Psyche, looks at, Orla, and she says something like, she says, like, I am learning different things about love that I did not know. I feel like I am looking into a dark pit, You know that my love for you runs to my deepest root, and that I could not replace it with a newer love. But now I see that love can be used as a means of politics and maneuver, and an instrument of torture. Yes, sister, I have learned. I am not sure if I like your love better than hatred. No matter what happens next, something between us has died here. And so Psyche then goes, so that Orla doesn't kill herself. She goes and takes a vow to her sisters to do it, and takes off the god's mask. And the valley is just full of wailing and terror, and it's full of light. And Psyche, then Orla hears this horrible wail across the valley. And Psyche, and then the god appears to Orla for a minute and says something along the lines of like, Psyche has been exiled. Now her days will be full of hunger and thirst and treading upon hard rocks. And so then Orla has to live with the weight of what she did, of which she had every reason to think she was doing the right thing, because everything Psyche was doing was crazy. And yet, because of the nature of the god, it was simply the case that Orla had to believe in Psyche. And yet, there was every reason not to believe. There was a radical break between the true and the rational, the coherent and the correspondent. What can be known only, you could only know what Psyche knew by doing it, by participating in it, by being part of it. Rationality could never give you that. Mm-hmm. And Lewis is what he's articulating, that break between the true and the rational, the correspondence and the coherence, the map and the territory. That is the space that Lewis is highlighting, is the difference between salvation and damnation. What you do in that space is what is so critical. And that is the space also that Hegel is suggesting in a different way, that we are heading toward, in consciousness, the development is heading toward a space of that decision where you will decide what you are going to do. It is precisely, this is what's so important in Hegel. It is precisely the point of absolute knowing, which is also when you can destroy the world. There is a progress in Hegel, but the progress is one that if you screw up, it's the worst that has ever been. Mm-hmm. It is precisely the potentiality that makes possible the greatest of all possible worlds, that makes possible the worst of all possible worlds. And what's so brilliant about Lewis, and I could certainly keep you here for another hour, and I will not do that. The brilliance about Lewis is that he locates the critical moment at the breaks between the rational and the true. And he also locates that at the point where damnation and salvation is determined. And he also locates it at the point where precisely the only way to know is to do, is to be in it, to be participating. Right. Where standing outside of it in rationality, following what according to that is the right thing, you will damn the person you love most to wailing and thirst and treading upon hard rocks. And that's what Lewis will articulate over and over again. And it's also in the Four Loves, where you disorder the Four Loves. Till We Have Faces is an important book. And the phrase is also, how can we meet face to face till we have faces? How can we meet face to face till we have faces? And there's this beautiful idea, if we see that in a Hegelian sense, that we don't have faces until we move in the direction of the absolute knowing, of which requires accepting our own limits, the role of paradox and contradiction, and developing consciousness for itself according to that, as opposed to the temptations of death drives and effacements found in AA thinking that soothe us, but not call us to something more, of which we can see in the character of Psyche.
Right. And that reminds me of in The Great Divorce, because I haven't read Till We Have Faces, but I have it right in front of me. So I'm definitely going to get on that. In The Great Divorce, you were talking about how comes a certain point where you just have to do it, and if you don't do it, you're not gonna get it. And that's really how they determine who's going to be how damnation is or salvation is determined.
Yeah, every character is brought to a decision. They're all brought to these decisions.
There's the I think it's near to the end. There's someone who's very far gone, right? And then they have I'm like just a really big person, kind of a saint or something, come, and it's like you need to make your decision now. You have to do it now. And like I guess there's like really I know in the Christian idea, if you have an idea of eternal hell, and like not because it's like God is standing at the door holding it, right? It's
Right.
because as you said, quoting Lewis, that the door to hell is locked from the inside. Uh, um, like there comes a point where you have to make a decision, and just not making a decision will um that is a decision in and of itself, right? And so I would like, how would you incorporate that within what you're talking about? And I know you and I want you to talk about this as well, the idea that true isn't rational. I know you guys wrote
Mm-hmm.
a whole book on that, right? It's on Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
which will
Mm-hmm.
be linked in the description.
Good man.
And like, how does that fit in within your ontology, this idea that event you just there comes a certain point where you have to make a decision, and being inactive is itself an action, but more like a negative action, which will uh lead you to damnation?
Well, and I think it's very important. So a few things. One, the choice that Orla leads herself into is a result of a series of choices
Mm-hmm.
that all kind of build upon one another. Also, too, there's the idea, you can almost look at it this way, because Orla in the end, well, I won't give away the ending. You know, there's always a possibility of quote unquote redemption. But the difficulty of the redemption is radical to the severity of the bad choice. It's almost like intensity. Like if I take a ball and I throw it lightly, you know, or maybe a boomerang, it will come back, but it will come back. But if I throw it really hard, it will take a long time. So there's almost like an issue of intensity. Like you can make certain choices where the intensity of the consequences is so great that the probability of you coming back from them is like very low. And it's almost like what you in Christian theology, there's the idea of practically damned. You're not technically damned, but you're practically damned because of the intensity of that choice. And then the mechanisms of self-deception and so on will come to where you will not choose to turn around, even though you theoretically could, because grace abounds. I've always found personally in my thinking the distinction between technical and practical is quite useful. Like I meant, like earlier, capitalism doesn't technically have to become a mixed market system or with corporations and so on, but it might practically always become one. Likewise, Marxism doesn't technically have to become Stalinism or something, but it could be the case that it practically always does, just because of how things unfold. And so similarly, you can have a situation where damnation, you could have choices that are so severe that it is practically the case that you will never come about, or maybe or it's 80% that you won't come about and 20% that you will, and so on and so forth. So the language of damnation and salvation in that context could have more of a probability theory. Then it's sort of like, well, you made the wrong choice, you turned the wrong corner, shoot, didn't go on, and different things like that. Also, quite importantly, there's something interesting that Lewis does in that book where he's kind of suggesting once a character makes a different choice, and so I don't ruin the plot. But maybe I can, because great literature, the more you know the plot, the more you want to read it. We said that at the beginning, right?
Right.
So there's this idea, where Lewis mentioned, like, he's like, if you choose to go to heaven, you look back on your life and it's like it was all heaven. But if you go to hell, you look back in your life and it was all hell. There's kind of this reach back in time thing he mentions in the Great Divorce, I think it was. So likewise, with the Till We Have Faces, once a character makes a redemptive choice, then actually the decision that caused all the despair is kind of absorbed into the redemption and intensifies the redemption and makes it more glorious, actually. Now, it didn't have to. Like, if they never turned around, the damnation would have just been damnation and nothing good would have come. But once it's turned around, it's like incorporated into it to actually make it all the better, sort of like the negations of, abstraction, negation, concretion. Like there's a kind of redemption, like sin, but it actually intensifies it now. That doesn't mean it's good that you went through it necessarily, but it does mean that it can always, according to how God does things, be incorporated in a manner that brings it to a higher state, which would get us into the weeds of theological consideration. But in the same way, what's really important is, therefore, what we're saying is damnation, salvation in the context of that story is a result of a perpetual reconstitution. Because you made this terrible choice, you then tend to make a series of choices every single day that continues to participate in that terrible choice that you made. So it's always reconstitution, just like the absolute re-knowing, redoing. It looks like determinism because it's like the same effect, but there's always a re-participation in that makes it look like a straight line, but really it's more like a bunch of circles that are heading in the same direction, right? So similarly, that's actually a really important concept of time that Hegel also, I think, wants to bring us on absolute knowing, because maintaining absolute knowing, since at any point can become that damnation moment with psyche, because the progress is always a contingent progress, there has to be a like absolute knowing isn't like a point you make and then it's a straight line or a straight ascensing. It's like you have to keep reconstituting it. You have to keep redoing it and doing it in the right way. And if you stop, in the same way that I mentioned a positive reaching back that incorporated it all, well, if you stop the absolute, it can reach back and do it negative. And suddenly, as it kind of reaches back in time, we were saying in the Great Divorce, and it was always part of heaven. Likewise, it can reach back in time and always be part of hell. Likewise, it can reach back in time and make it always part of the process of absolute knowing, or it can reach back in time and make it like it was never part of the process of absolute knowing. It can reach back in time and make it a negation that makes possible a sublation, or it can reach back in time and make it all an effacement. So it's important to understand that role of time as well, because there's a perpetual reconstitution of the meaning of it all relative to the now.
Right. And so, and there comes a point when you have all this development towards the end where you make your final decision. And as you were talking about, it's almost like it's not like it retroactively changes. The future changes the past in the sense that it's given its meaning, because the meaning of the past the past only has meaning in relation to the future. So you're determining what the past was based on your final action. And it's that final action for Lewis in The Great Divorce. Time is very important because it's almost like time. Like I like to think of it as literally time was closing in on the people in purgatory, whatever you want to call it. And that is why, for example, angels are in Christian theology. They are beyond time, and because and they don't change because they're not subject to time, and because they don't change, they have one choice. They have that same choice, and they can either fall but angels are not like humans who can grow and have these multiple choices, but eventually they are going to have to make a final decision, because eventually time doesn't just go on forever. There is a telos to time, and it will end in eternity, because that is the actual full actualization of time. Because if you think about it, the present is just a slice of eternity. That's all the present is. And the past and the future technically have no being in that sense. And it has no being. If you have no idea of eternity, you cannot think anything. You cannot think the past and future, because you can only have the present. That's only what has being, but the present is an infinitely small regression. And I guess we could even say that this is really what hell is instead of choosing eternity in that act, you're choosing the present, which is itself. So the present is like St. Augustine talks about this in the Confessions. He's talking about time, how he even says he just couldn't figure it out. He couldn't figure out what time is. He just gave up, I guess. He tried his best. And because time for him is always becoming other to itself. But if you are embracing this the present in this way, you are, as you're saying, like hell is like a dust ball. I think that's how it's described. It doesn't even have room for an apple, right? Because it is this very small place, which is ultimately yourself, because you without the other are infinitesimally small, and that's the night of the world. That's what hell is, etc. Right?
Oh yeah. Well, another way to look at it is hell is all. You can make a choice that then sets the trajectory of your constant constitution that is hellish. Or you can make a choice that's going to set it in a certain direction that makes your perpetual reconstitution heavenly, per se. It's like, for example, when people get a divorce and have irreconcilable differences, which is interesting because technically no differences are irreconcilable. You could always make up. But there comes a point where people are like, no, they can't. They technically could always make up, but not practically, because of the wounds and so on and so forth.
Sorry to interrupt, that would be for Christianity, the difference. That would be the difference between venial and mortal sin.
Yes.
There's really how you can conceptualize mortal sin. It's not that the action itself is just so terrible. Like as Augustine says, it's not the stuff. Nothing that exists is bad in Christian theology,
Right,
because
right.
evil is non-existence. But you have uh um you are right, evil is non-existence. So really, a mortal sin is severing your relationship to God,
Yeah.
um, in the same way as it's an irreconcilable difference, in the sense that you need to, like, the difference, I guess, between humans is you reach a point sometimes where there can be no forgiveness. But of course, with the Christian God, there always is forgiveness. But that's what a mortal sin is. And that is what the distinction is. It's breaking the relationship more than can be healed. Just like you need to do some extra steps to heal the wound you have caused, or the divide you've made.
Well, the critical notion there, if evil is a privation, and a privation of being, I guess in Timothy, everything that God created is good. It brought with thanksgiving. So there's a certain relation, a certain orientation. What's very interesting is what C.S. Lewis often depicts in his Christian theology is, in fact, a idea that the bad, the evil, is a result of disordered relationships, disordered trajectories, projections, but that the evil is not located in the substance. It is located in the relation to the substance. And that would make sense if subject is substance, and subjects are primarily relational. This is very similar into Hegel's thinking, that the issue is order. There's nothing bad with science. The problem is when science effaces the subject. But there's also a problem when consciousness is trying to be for itself, and it's not doing so in concert dialectically with materiality. There is a certain relationship that is needed for the process of absolute knowing, and a certain order. There is a certain order that consciousness tends to emerge into higher states of consciousness. And likewise, that there is a certain order, a certain proportion, I guess is the term you'll hear, that is used. These are, I think, what you see in CS, like that kind of thinking, you actually will see quite a bit of parallels. And also too, that if you have this idea that there's that the thinking of this world, you're in the world, but not of it, right? That idea. That's really interesting. That sounds a lot like the map isn't the territory, right? You're in this world, but not of it, that there is some kind of break between the truth and what you tend to think is true, because why is Satan as a deceptor in different things and so on and so on. Oh, I want to know, when you mentioned about angel, so angels are constituted by a choice, where humans are reconstituted because they are in time. They're always reconstituted.
Yes.
And the is important in the same way that the infinity, which is a human thing because it requires time, because it comes out of the finite, is therefore reconstituted by the finite. There's a perpetual reconstitution of the infinite by the finite. And a way to think, I always like to think about the infinite with the in parentheses, which means the most present dimension of the infinite is the finite, of which is in the infinite. If the finite is in the infinite, and it's kind of a loop in that sort of grammar structure. But the finite is always reconstituting the infinite, in the same way that the human is always reconstituted, whereas angels are constituted. Right. And so likewise, so again, another way to view this, we go back to that distinction between the truth and the absolute. The truth, everything that is the case, is constituted. It's just constituted. Whereas the absolute is everything that is the case plus us, substance equals subject, is reconstituted. One of the problems with seeking the truth, which is arguably what hard materialism, empiricism, and the meaning crisis all result, the problem is you're trying to make humans like angels. You're trying to have, the reason we have a meaning crisis is because we're trying to get an identity of constitution, which means we would have to be minds without bodies, because, angels are minds without bodies, and we are not minds without bodies. We are minds with bodies. So if we are minds with bodies, but we are seeking a constitution in the truth, then we are trying to make ourselves angels. And that means we're going effacement. That is not a negation, that is effacement. What we need to do is accept that we are minds with bodies, and therefore seek reconstitution, which would mean we are toward the absolute. And so absolute knowing entails finding identity in reconstitution, the perpetual act, the constant doing, the constant daily repentance, if you will, the turning toward the right way, to be rightly ordered.